June 19th, 1944. Above the Philippine Sea, Lieutenant Commander Takeo Shibata banked his Mitsubishi Zero through scattered clouds at 28,000 feet, scanning the horizon for the American carrier strike force his radar controllers had detected an hour earlier. For 3 years, this moment had meant inevitable victory. The Zero's legendary maneuverability and combat-proven superiority had made Japanese naval aviators untouchable across the Pacific. Through the haze, Shibata spotted them. Dozens of unfamiliar American fighters climbing toward his formation with a confidence that seemed absurd. These new aircraft looked nothing like the fragile Wildcats his squadron had slaughtered over Coral Sea and Midway. They appeared bulky, ungainly, almost comically oversized compared to the sleek Zero. His wingman, Lieutenant Hiroshi Nishizawa, laughed over the radio. "Fat American pigs," he called them. Easy targets that would burn as quickly as their predecessors. But inside each Grumman F-6F Hellcat sat 650 caliber Browning machine guns loaded with 2,400 rounds of ammunition. Behind that firepower sat a Pratt & Whitney R 2800 double wasp engine, producing over 2,000 horsepower, armor plating protecting the pilot's vitals, and self-sealing fuel tanks that Japanese engineers still couldn't manufacture reliably. Most critically, these Hellcats carried American pilots trained specifically to destroy Zeros, using tactics the Japanese had never encountered. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. Shibata dove toward the approaching formation, confident his veteran pilots would demonstrate once again why the Zero remained supreme in Pacific skies. He had no idea he was leading his squadron into a carefully prepared killing ground that would end Japanese naval aviation's dominance forever. The morning sun broke across the USS Yorktown's flight deck as Lieutenant Alex Vrasiu completed his pre-flight inspection of his assigned Hellcat, his boots leaving prints on the salt-encrusted non-skid surface. The massive fighter stretched 33 feet from propeller spinner to tail, its broad wings spanning 42 feet of American aluminum and steel, reinforced with armor plating that added over 600 pounds to the aircraft's empty weight. At 9,153 pounds empty, the Hellcat dwarfed the Zeros it was designed to destroy, outweighing the Japanese fighter by nearly 3,000 pounds. Yet, this apparent disadvantage masked revolutionary engineering that would transform Pacific air combat from a contest of individual skill into systematic slaughter favoring American industrial might. Vrasiu ran his hand along the cowling, feeling the cold metal that enclosed the massive radial engine beneath. The Pratt & Whitney R 2800 double wasp represented the pinnacle of American aviation engine technology. 18 cylinders arranged in 2 rows, each cylinder displacement larger than many automobile engines. When pushed to war emergency power, this massive power plant produced over 2,100 horsepower, enough to drive the heavy Hellcat to speeds exceeding 380 miles per hour in level flight. The engineering philosophy behind the Hellcat represented a fundamental departure from Japanese design priorities. Where Mitsubishi engineers had created the Zero by eliminating every possible ounce of weight, sacrificing pilot protection and structural strength to maximize maneuverability, Grumman's designers had built the Hellcat around pilot survival and mission effectiveness. The result was an aircraft that could absorb punishment that would disintegrate a Zero while maintaining combat performance that matched or exceeded the Japanese fighter in every category except turning radius. Across the Pacific at Tinian Airfield, Commander Minoru Genda studied intelligence photographs of the new American fighter with growing concern. His analysts had identified the type as the F-6F Hellcat, and initial reports from pilots who had encountered the aircraft suggested it possessed capabilities that challenged every assumption about American fighter design. The photographs showed an ungainly beast that seemed to embody American industrial excess. Too heavy, too large, too wasteful of scarce materials to be effective in combat. Yet, the combat loss reports told a different story. In the 6 months since Hellcats had entered combat operations, Zero squadrons had suffered unprecedented casualties. Japanese pilots who had survived encounters with the new American fighter described an aircraft that could match the Zero's climb rate, exceed its diving speed, and deliver firepower that could saw a Japanese fighter in half with a single burst. Genda understood that these reports, if accurate, represented an existential threat to Japanese naval aviation. The Zero's supremacy had been built on a combination of superior range, exceptional maneuverability, and pilot training that emphasized individual combat skills. If American engineers had created a fighter that neutralized these advantages while adding overwhelming firepower and structural superiority, Japanese carrier operations would become unsustainable against American numerical and technological advantages. The numbers painted a picture that Genda struggled to accept. American intelligence estimated that Grumman was producing over 600 Hellcats per month, while Japanese aircraft production had peaked at fewer than 300 fighters across all types. More troubling, each Hellcat carried sophisticated equipment that Japanese industry could not duplicate at any production scale. Self-sealing fuel tanks that prevented catastrophic fires from fuel leaks, armor plating that protected pilots from defensive fire, radio equipment that provided crystal-clear communication across hundreds of miles, oxygen systems that allowed comfortable operations above 30,000 feet. Vratziu climbed into his cockpit and surveyed the instrument panel, a comprehensive array of gauges and controls that monitored every aspect of the Hellcat's complex systems: manifold pressure, oil pressure, fuel pressure, cylinder head temperature, oil temperature, each reading critical to maintaining the massive fighter's performance envelope. The complexity of these systems far exceeded anything Japanese pilots managed in their simpler, lighter Zeros. 650 caliber Browning M2 machine guns filled the wings, 3 in each panel, their ammunition boxes loaded with 400 rounds per gun. Each weapon could fire 800 rounds per minute, creating a combined rate of fire that delivered devastating destruction in concentrated bursts. When all 6 guns fired simultaneously, they produced a stream of half-inch diameter projectiles, weighing over 42 pounds per minute, enough kinetic energy to destroy any aircraft in the Japanese inventory or penetrate light armor on ground targets. The ammunition itself represented another American advantage that Japanese intelligence had failed to appreciate fully. Each 50 caliber round carried enough energy to penetrate armor plate that would stop rifle bullets, and when mixed with armor-piercing incendiary and tracer rounds, a single burst from a Hellcat could set fuel tanks ablaze, destroy engines, or kill pilots through sheer concussive force, even without direct hits. At Japanese Naval Aviation Headquarters in Tokyo, Vice Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa reviewed fleet readiness reports with mounting alarm. His carrier air groups had been the most powerful naval aviation force in the world during 1942, capable of projecting power across thousands of miles of ocean and destroying enemy fleets with impunity. Now, those same air groups faced replacement pilots with fewer than 100 hours of flight time, aircraft maintained with salvaged parts and improvised repairs, and mission planning dominated by desperate attempts to achieve tactical surprise before American fighters could intercept. The transformation had been gradual, but inexorable. Early encounters between Zeros and Hellcats had produced mixed results, with Japanese pilots using superior maneuverability to achieve victories in turning combat. But American tacticians had quickly identified the Hellcats' advantages and developed combat doctrines that exploited American strengths while avoiding Japanese capabilities. The result was a systematic slaughter that Japanese training and tradition could not counter. Vratziu's squadron commander, Lieutenant Commander Edward O'Hare, gathered his pilots around the ready room blackboard as deck crews prepared their aircraft for launch. The mission briefing was straightforward. Intercept the incoming Japanese. Strike force detected by radar at 150 miles. Destroy as many enemy aircraft as possible before they could reach the carrier task force. Then pursue survivors back to their carriers and destroy them on deck if fuel permitted. What made this mission revolutionary was the confidence with which American commanders planned offensive operations that would have been suicidal just 2 years earlier. The Hellcat had transformed American carrier aviation from desperate defense to offensive dominance, allowing fleet commanders to project power with the certainty that their fighters could destroy any Japanese formation, regardless of numbers or tactical position. The Hellcat's true advantage lay not in any single performance characteristic, but in the combination of capabilities that made it effective across all combat scenarios. At high altitude, its supercharged engine maintained power where Zeros began to struggle. At medium altitude, its speed and climbing ability matched or exceeded Japanese fighters. At low altitude, its structural strength allowed diving attacks that would tear wings off Zeros attempting to follow. Most importantly, its armor and self-sealing tanks meant that hits that would destroy a Zero often left Hellcats flyable. Grumman's engineers had solved the fundamental problem of carrier-based fighter design through brute force application of American industrial capability. Where Japanese designers accepted compromises to meet weight and complexity constraints, Americans simply built stronger engines, tougher structures, and more reliable systems. The result was an aircraft that weighed nearly twice as much as a Zero, but could still match its performance, while providing pilot protection and firepower that Japanese engineers considered impossible within carrier aviation's constraints. As engines coughed to life across Yorktown's deck, Vrasiu strapped himself into his parachute and adjusted his oxygen mask. The Japanese were about to discover that American naval aviation had evolved beyond the desperate defensive struggles of 1942. The Hellcat represented not just a better fighter, but a fundamentally different approach to air combat that prioritized systematic destruction over individual prowess. The Hellcats rolled toward the catapult in formation, their massive propellers creating visible vortices of condensation in the humid Pacific air. In less than 90 minutes, they would intercept Commander Shibata's strike force and begin teaching Japanese naval aviators that assumptions about American technological inferiority would prove fatally incorrect. The transformation from mockery to terror would be measured in minutes, recorded in gun camera footage, and documented in loss reports that would shatter Japanese confidence forever. The radar contact solidified at 87 miles, as Vrasiu's division climbed through 22,000 feet, heading west toward the incoming Japanese strike. "Lieutenant," Commander O'Hare's voice crackled over the radio with tactical updates. "Bogies at Angels 25, heading 090, estimated strength 70-plus aircraft." The numbers represented one of the largest Japanese carrier strikes launched since Midway, a desperate gamble by Admiral Ozawa to destroy American carriers before their overwhelming fighter superiority could render Japanese naval aviation irrelevant. Vrasiu checked his gun switches, ensuring all 650s were armed and ready. The Hellcat's gun sight projected a simple illuminated reticle onto the windscreen, far less sophisticated than the computing sights installed in some American fighters, but perfectly adequate for the type of combat Grumman's designers had envisioned. The concentrated firepower of 6 heavy machine guns meant that precise deflection shooting became less critical. A pilot who could place his aircraft in the general vicinity of an enemy fighter could rely on sheer volume of fire to achieve lethal hits. The Japanese formation appeared as dots against the horizon at 12 miles, resolved into distinct aircraft types at 8 miles, and became individual targets at 4 miles. Shibata's strike force consisted of approximately 40 Mitsubishi A6M50s, providing fighter escort for 30 Aichi-D, 3 A dive bombers, the entire formation flying in the tight defensive pattern that Japanese doctrine prescribed for long-range strikes. O'Hare ordered the textbook Hellcat attack profile that American pilots had perfected through 6 months of combat refinement. The 32 Hellcats split into 4 divisions, with 2 divisions climbing to gain altitude advantage, while 2 divisions maintained position to block any Japanese attempt to dive away. This vertical separation ensured that Japanese fighters attempting to engage one group would expose themselves to attack from above, while any attempt to escape downward would be intercepted by the lower divisions. Shibata recognized the American tactical setup immediately and ordered his Zeros to climb and engage the higher Hellcat divisions before they could achieve decisive altitude advantage. It was exactly the response American tacticians had predicted and trained for. As the Zeros climbed toward the higher Hellcat divisions, their airspeed bled off, and their formations became stretched and vulnerable. Vrasiu's division dove from 28,000 feet, with throttles pushed to war emergency power. The Hellcats accelerated to over 400 miles per hour in the dive, building kinetic energy that Japanese pilots trained for turning combat had no doctrine to counter. The closing speed between diving Hellcats and climbing Zeros exceeded 600 miles per hour, giving Japanese pilots less than 3 seconds to react from visual acquisition to weapons range. The first Zero disintegrated under Vrasyu's opening burst at 800 yards. His 650s fired for exactly 1.3 seconds, delivering 78 half-inch bullets that struck the Zero's engine, cockpit, and wing root with enough kinetic energy to tear the lightweight fighter into 3 distinct pieces. The wreckage tumbled past Vrasyu's canopy close enough that he could see the rising sun insignia on the detached wing panel. His wingman, Ensign Homer Brockmeyer, destroyed 2 additional Zeros in the same diving pass, demonstrating the devastating effectiveness of coordinated Hellcat attacks against Japanese formations. The American fighters plunged through Shibata's escort screen in less than 8 seconds, destroying 9 Zeros before the surviving Japanese pilots could maneuver to respond. O'Hare's tactical innovation appeared in the next phase of the engagement. Instead of attempting to turn with the remaining Zeros, a mistake that had cost American pilots their lives in earlier battles, the Hellcat pilots continued their dives to 18,000 feet, then used their superior engine power to climb back to altitude on the opposite side of the Japanese formation. This boom and zoom tactic eliminated the Zero's turning advantage while exploiting the Hellcat's superior speed and power-to-weight ratio. Shibata attempted to reform his scattered Zeros into defensive circles, a maneuver that had proven effective against earlier American fighters. But Hellcat pilots simply ignored the circling Japanese fighters and attacked the vulnerable dive bombers that represented the actual threat to American carriers. Without fighter protection, the slow, lightly armed Aichis became target practice for American pilots who could approach from any direction with impunity. Vrasyu destroyed 3 dive bombers in a single climbing attack that demonstrated the Hellcat's ability to maintain combat effectiveness across multiple engagements. His ammunition counter showed he had fired fewer than 600 rounds, less than 1/4 of his total load, meaning he could continue offensive operations for extended periods. Japanese pilots flying Zeros with limited ammunition capacity typically conserved their fire for high-percentage shots, a tactical constraint that American pilots with abundant ammunition never faced. The engagement lasted 19 minutes, from initial contact to the final destruction of the last Japanese dive bomber attempting to escape at wave-top height. American combat air patrol fighters from 3 different carriers had converged on Shibata's strike force, creating overwhelming numerical and tactical superiority that Japanese training could not overcome. The final count showed 61 Japanese aircraft destroyed against 2 Hellcats damaged by defensive fire from dive bomber rear gunners. Shibata survived the massacre, his Zero riddled with 50 caliber holes and his engine streaming coolant as he limped toward the last reported position of Admiral Ozawa's carriers. His radio calls to surviving pilots revealed the psychological shock that was spreading through Japanese naval aviation. The Americans were no longer fighting defensively. They were hunting with systematic precision that suggested carefully developed tactics rather than improvised responses. Lieutenant Nishizawa, one of only 7 Zero pilots to return from the mission, provided the combat report that would circulate through Japanese carrier ready rooms within hours. He described American fighters that seemed immune to the turning combat that had defined Pacific air warfare since 1941. The Hellcats refused to dogfight, instead using superior speed and firepower to destroy Japanese aircraft through coordinated attacks that exploited every American advantage while avoiding every Japanese strength. More troubling for Japanese commanders, Nishizawa reported that American pilots had demonstrated precise formation discipline throughout the engagement, maintaining tactical coordination that allowed them to support each other effectively. This represented a fundamental shift from earlier battles where American fighters had often become separated and vulnerable during turning combat. The Hellcat's performance characteristics apparently allowed American pilots to maintain formation integrity while conducting offensive maneuvers, something Japanese intelligence had considered impossible for such a heavy fighter. Admiral Ozawa received Shibata's after-action report in his flag plot aboard the carrier Taiho with mounting despair. The loss of 61 aircraft represented nearly 40% of his total strike capability, and most of those losses had been inflicted before his aircraft could reach their targets. More significantly, the report confirmed that American fighters now possessed both numerical and qualitative superiority that made Japanese carrier operations unsustainable in contested airspace. The human cost extended beyond the aircraft losses. 37 experienced naval aviators had been killed, including 6 veteran fighter pilots who had survived since Pearl Harbor. These men represented irreplaceable expertise that Japanese training programs could not duplicate with the time and resources available. New Japanese pilots arriving at carrier squadrons could expect fewer than 40 hours of advanced training, while American replacement pilots completed over 300 hours, including extensive gunnery practice and tactical formation flying. Vraciu's gun camera footage, developed and analyzed aboard Yorktown that evening, provided American intelligence with detailed documentation of Hellcat combat effectiveness. The film showed that concentrated .50 caliber fire could destroy Zeros with burst lengths of less than 2 seconds, confirming that American pilots could engage multiple targets in a single pass without exhausting their ammunition. More importantly, the footage demonstrated that Hellcat pilots could maintain accurate fire while pulling significant G-forces during high-speed maneuvers, something Japanese pilots in lighter aircraft struggled to accomplish. The tactical lessons from this engagement rippled through American naval aviation within days. Fleet commanders recognized that Hellcat squadrons could now conduct offensive fighter sweeps deep into Japanese-controlled airspace, attacking enemy aircraft before they could threaten American carriers. This represented a complete reversal of the defensive philosophy that had dominated American carrier operations since Coral Sea. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The transformation accelerated through summer 1944 as Hellcat production ramped up and American pilots refined their tactics through continuous combat operations. Japanese commanders found themselves fighting a war of attrition they could not win, losing experienced pilots faster than training programs could replace them while facing American squadrons that grew stronger with each engagement. Commander Genda's worst fears were being realized with mathematical precision. The Hellcat had not just matched the Zero's capabilities, it had rendered Japanese naval aviation doctrine obsolete through a combination of superior engineering, overwhelming production capacity, and tactical innovation that exploited every American advantage. The ungainly fighter that Japanese pilots had mocked was becoming the instrument of their systematic destruction. The morning of June 20th brought clear skies over the Philippine Sea as American radar operators detected another large Japanese strike forming at extreme range. Admiral Mark Mitchell, commanding Task Force 58 from his flag bridge aboard Lexington, ordered an immediate fighter sweep toward the enemy carriers rather than waiting to receive the Japanese attack. This aggressive response would have been unthinkable in 1942, but Hellcat superiority now allowed American commanders to dictate the terms of engagement. Vraciu led his 8-plane division west at 25,000 feet, climbing toward the enemy formation that intelligence estimated included over 40 fighters and 30 attack aircraft. His Hellcat felt solid beneath him, responding to control inputs with predictable authority that inspired confidence. The massive fighter's handling characteristics fell somewhere between nimble and ponderous, lacking the Zero's instant response but providing stability that made it an ideal gun platform. The philosophical difference between American and Japanese fighter design became apparent in moments like this. Japanese engineers had optimized the Zero for individual combat, where split-second maneuverability could mean the difference between victory and defeat. American engineers had built the Hellcat for systematic destruction, where coordinated formations using standardized tactics would grind down enemy air forces through superior firepower and survivability. At 32 miles from the enemy formation, Vraciu spotted the distinctive silhouettes of Zeros and Judys climbing toward his altitude. The Japanese pilots were following established doctrine, seeking to gain altitude advantage before engaging American fighters. But Hellcat performance at high altitude nullified this traditional Japanese tactic. The R-2800 engine's two-stage supercharger maintained full power up to 25,000 feet, allowing Hellcats to match or exceed zero climb rates well into the stratosphere. Vrasiu ordered his division into a shallow dive that traded altitude for speed, building kinetic energy for the coming engagement. The Hellcats accelerated to 390 miles per hour, fast enough to control engagement timing, but slow enough to maintain formation integrity. Japanese fighters attempting to intercept would need to dive from above, giving away their altitude advantage, or climb from below, surrendering speed and energy position. The tactical trap was elegantly simple and devastatingly effective. Japanese pilots trained for turning combat found themselves forced into energy-based maneuvers their doctrine had never emphasized. Zero pilots who attempted to turn with diving Hellcats discovered they couldn't maintain the turn radius needed to achieve firing solutions before the American fighters extended away at speeds the Zero couldn't match. Conversely, Japanese pilots who tried to engage in diving attacks found their lightweight fighters shaking and buffeting at speeds where Hellcats remained stable and controllable. The engagement began at 18,000 feet, when Vrasiu's division intercepted a formation of 16 Judy dive bombers, escorted by 12 Zeros. The American tactical response had become standardized through months of combat refinement. 4 Hellcats climbed to engage the Zero escort, while 4 attacked the vulnerable dive bombers below. This division of labor maximized destruction while minimizing risk, allowing American pilots to exploit their numerical and technological advantages systematically. Vrasiu selected a Judy at the formation's trailing edge and closed to 400 yards before opening fire. His 650s converged their fire slightly ahead of the Japanese aircraft, allowing the dive bomber to fly into the stream of bullets rather than requiring precise deflection shooting. The Judy's right wing separated from the fuselage as armor-piercing incendiary rounds detonated in the wing root fuel tank. The aircraft rolled inverted and plunged toward the ocean 30,000 feet below. His second target attempted evasive maneuvers, diving toward the ocean surface in a desperate attempt to escape. Vrasiu followed the Judy down through 15,000 feet, his Hellcat accelerating smoothly to 420 miles per hour in the dive. The Japanese aircraft's control surfaces began fluttering at this speed, limiting the pilot's ability to maneuver aggressively. Vrasiu fired a 3-second burst that walked his fire from the Judy's tail through the cockpit and into the engine. The dive bomber exploded in a fireball that briefly obscured Vrasiu's windscreen. Above him, the 4 Hellcats engaging the Zero escort had destroyed 7 Japanese fighters in less than 90 seconds, using coordinated attacks that prevented the surviving Zeros from forming defensive formations. The remaining Japanese pilots scattered, abandoning the dive bombers they were supposed to protect. This collapse of formation discipline under pressure revealed the fundamental weakness in Japanese training that emphasized individual combat skills over coordinated defensive tactics. Ensign Brockmeyer destroyed 3 more Judys in a single pass, his ammunition expenditure totaling fewer than 800 rounds. The efficiency of Hellcat gunnery reflected both superior firepower concentration and improved pilot training that emphasized short, accurate bursts rather than extended spray and pray firing. American pilots learned to fire in 1 to 3 second bursts, allowing their gun barrels to cool between engagements and maximizing ammunition conservation for multiple targets. The psychological impact on surviving Japanese pilots was immediate and profound. Lieutenant Masao Iizuka, flying as Shibata's wingman, watched in horror as American fighters destroyed his entire squadron in less than 10 minutes of combat. His Zero had sustained multiple hits from a Hellcat that had attacked so quickly Iizuka never achieved a firing solution. The American pilot had appeared from above, fired a devastating burst, and climbed away before Iizuka could react. The engagement violated every principle of air combat his instructors had taught. More troubling, Iizuka recognized that the American tactics were not improvised responses, but carefully rehearsed procedures executed with mechanical precision. The Hellcat, pilots maintained formation throughout the engagement, communicated constantly over their radios, and supported each other through coordinated maneuvers that suggested extensive training in team tactics. Japanese fighter doctrine, by contrast, emphasized individual initiative and aircraft performance, creating situations where veteran pilots could achieve victories, but average pilots became isolated and vulnerable. Admiral Ozawa's desperate gamble to destroy American carriers through overwhelming strike strength had failed catastrophically. His afternoon strike lost 47 aircraft to Hellcat combat air patrols before reaching their targets, while the few Japanese aircraft that penetrated American fighter screens encountered intense anti-aircraft fire from ships equipped with proximity-fused shells and radar-directed fire control. The total losses for the day reached 97 aircraft destroyed, nearly 45% of Ozawa's total carrier air strength. The Battle of the Philippine Sea, which American pilots would nickname the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, represented the decisive turning point in Pacific naval aviation. Japanese carrier air groups that had terrorized Allied forces since Pearl Harbor were effectively destroyed in 2 days of combat, losing over 300 aircraft and 250 irreplaceable veteran pilots. American losses totaled 29 aircraft, mostly to operational accidents rather than enemy action. Commander Genda, analyzing the battle reports from his headquarters in Tokyo, understood that Japanese naval aviation had suffered a defeat from which it could never recover. The Hellcat had proven itself superior to the Zero in every combat scenario that mattered. It could outclimb Japanese fighters at high altitude, outdive them at medium altitude, and absorb damage that would destroy any Japanese aircraft. Most devastatingly, American production was delivering over 600 Hellcats per month, while Japanese factories struggled to build 200 fighters of all types. The human dimensions of this catastrophe extended beyond statistics. Japanese pilots who survived the Philippine Sea battle returned to their carriers psychologically shattered by encounters with an aircraft they could neither evade nor defeat. The confident naval aviators who had dominated Pacific skies for 3 years had been replaced by desperate men flying obsolete aircraft against enemies who possessed overwhelming advantages in technology, training, and numbers. Lieutenant Iizuka's combat diary entry from June 21st captured the emotional devastation that swept through Japanese carrier squadrons. We launched this morning believing our superior skills and the Zero's proven capabilities would carry us to victory. We returned tonight having watched our squadrons destroyed by American fighters that treated us like targets in a shooting gallery. The fat fighters we mocked are killing us with methodical efficiency that makes our courage meaningless. Vrasiu's personal victory tally from the Philippine Sea battle reached 19 confirmed kills, making him one of the US Navy's leading aces. But his after-action reports emphasized that individual skill had been less important than systematic application of Hellcat advantages through coordinated tactics. American naval aviation had evolved beyond the individual combat paradigm that still dominated Japanese thinking, creating a force multiplier effect that made each Hellcat more effective than its specifications suggested. The tactical innovations that emerged from the Philippine Sea battle would define carrier aviation for the remainder of the war. American commanders recognized that Hellcat's superiority allowed offensive fighter sweeps against Japanese airfields, destroying enemy aircraft on the ground before they could threaten American carriers. This represented a fundamental shift from defensive combat air patrols to offensive air supremacy operations. Captain David McCampbell, commanding Air Group 15 aboard Essex, pioneered these offensive tactics during operations in the Philippine Islands through autumn 1944. His squadrons would launch at dawn and fly 300 miles to Japanese airfields, arriving as enemy aircraft were preparing for morning patrols. The Hellcats would strafe parked aircraft, destroy ground facilities, and engage any Japanese fighters that managed to launch. The effectiveness of these operations exceeded every prediction. On October 14th, McCampbell personally destroyed 9 Japanese aircraft in a single mission over Leyte, demonstrating both the Hellcat's ammunition capacity and the vulnerability of Japanese air defenses to aggressive American tactics. His gun camera footage showed Japanese fighters attempting to take off as Hellcats strafed the runway, destroying aircraft before their pilots could retract landing gear. Japanese air commanders found themselves paralyzed by Hellcat offensive operations. Traditional defensive measures, such as maintaining standing combat air patrols over airfields, proved prohibitively expensive in fuel and pilot fatigue while providing minimal protection. Hellcat formations could appear anywhere at any time, attack with devastating firepower, and escape before Japanese fighters could coordinate effective responses. Lieutenant Commander Tadashi Nakajima, commanding a Zero squadron at Clark Field in the Philippines, experienced this helplessness firsthand during repeated Hellcat attacks through October and November 1944. His diary recorded 18 separate American fighter sweeps that destroyed over 60 aircraft on the ground and killed 22 pilots before they could reach their cockpits. The psychological impact of these attacks eroded Japanese morale more effectively than combat losses, creating a pervasive sense that resistance was futile. The Hellcat's evolution into a multi-role platform demonstrated American tactical flexibility that Japanese commanders could not match. While the aircraft had been designed primarily for air superiority, pilots quickly discovered its 650 caliber machine guns were devastatingly effective against ground targets. Hellcats began carrying bombs and rockets on ground attack missions, destroying Japanese logistics infrastructure with the same methodical efficiency they applied to aerial combat. Ensign Brockmeyer's squadron pioneered Hellcat ground attack tactics during operations, supporting the Leyte invasion in October 1944. His 8-plane division would approach Japanese supply depots at low altitude, each aircraft carrying 2 500-pound bombs and full machine gun ammunition. The bombs would destroy fuel dumps and ammunition storage, while the 50 calibers would strafe trucks, locomotives, and port facilities. The cumulative effect of these attacks was the systematic destruction of Japanese logistics capability across the Philippine Islands. Supply convoys that had operated safely under air cover from Zero squadrons now faced Hellcat attacks they could neither prevent nor survive. Japanese ground commanders found their forces immobilized by fuel shortages and ammunition scarcity created by American air superiority. Commander Shibata's final combat mission on November 8th illustrated the complete reversal of Pacific air power that had occurred since 1942. Leading 6 Zeros on a dawn patrol over Manila Bay, his formation was intercepted by 12 Hellcats from McCampbell's air group. The American fighters attacked from multiple directions simultaneously, destroying 4 Zeros in the opening pass. Shibata and one wingman escaped by diving to wave-top height and flying through a rainstorm that provided temporary concealment. His after-action report acknowledged what many Japanese pilots had privately concluded. The Zero could no longer compete with American fighters in any combat scenario. The aircraft that had once dominated Pacific skies through superior performance and pilot skill was now obsolete, outclassed by American engineering and industrial capacity. Shibata recommended immediate development of replacement fighters with armor protection, self-sealing tanks, and firepower comparable to American standards. Japanese aircraft designers had already reached similar conclusions, but implementing these recommendations proved impossible given Japan's collapsing industrial infrastructure. American submarine blockades had reduced the flow of strategic materials to a trickle, while B-29 raids were systematically destroying Japanese aircraft factories. New Japanese fighter designs like the Kawanishi N-1K and Mitsubishi J-2M incorporated armor and firepower improvements, but production numbers remained pathetically small compared to American output. The statistical evidence of Hellcat dominance became undeniable as 1944 ended. U.S. Navy fighter squadrons had destroyed over 2,000 Japanese aircraft while losing fewer than 200 Hellcats to all causes, creating an exchange ratio of 10-1 that exceeded every pre-war prediction. More importantly, American replacement pilots arrived at carrier squadrons with over 300 hours of flight time and extensive gunnery training, while Japanese replacements averaged fewer than 50 hours and minimal combat preparation. Vice Admiral Takejiro Onishi, assuming command of Japanese naval aviation in the Philippines during October 1944, recognized that conventional tactics could no longer achieve meaningful results against American air superiority. His solution was the formation of special attack units, kamikaze squadrons that would abandon air combat entirely and focus on suicidal crashes into American ships. This desperate measure represented the ultimate admission that Japanese pilots could no longer compete with Hellcat squadrons in aerial combat. The transformation from proud naval aviators trained for air superiority to suicide attackers occurred with shocking speed. Pilots like Lieutenant Iizuka, who had survived the Philippine Sea battle and dozens of subsequent engagements, volunteered for kamikaze missions because they offered the only remaining opportunity to damage American naval forces. The psychological journey from confident warrior to willing suicide reflected the devastating impact of systematic defeat by an enemy they could neither match nor escape. Hellcat pilots found themselves facing a new and terrible challenge as kamikaze attacks began in October 1944. The Japanese aircraft no longer attempted to fight or evade, but simply drove toward American ships with single-minded determination. Hellcat combat air patrols had to intercept and destroy every attacker before it could reach the fleet, a defensive requirement that tested American pilots' skill and nerve. Captain McCampbell's tactics evolved to meet this threat through the development of layered defensive zones around American carrier task forces. Multiple Hellcat divisions patrolled at different altitudes and distances from the fleet, creating overlapping engagement zones that forced kamikaze aircraft to run a gauntlet of defensive fire. The system proved remarkably effective, with most kamikaze attacks being intercepted 30 to 50 miles from their targets. Lieutenant Vratsu's encounter with a kamikaze formation on November 25th demonstrated both the effectiveness of Hellcat defensive tactics and the terrible human cost of Japan's desperation. His division intercepted 8 Zeros loaded with bombs approaching the task force at 15,000 feet. The Japanese pilots made no attempt to evade or return fire, simply continuing their attack runs even as Hellcat fire destroyed their aircraft one by one. Vratsu destroyed 4 kamikazes in a single pass, but 2 Japanese aircraft penetrated the Hellcat screen and struck the carrier Intrepid, killing 69 American sailors. The tactical victory of shooting down 6 of 8 attackers felt hollow in the face of the damage achieved by the survivors. This paradox defined the final phase of the Pacific Air War, where American fighters achieved overwhelming superiority, yet could not prevent determined suicide attacks from inflicting casualties. The psychological impact on American pilots was profound. Vratsu's combat diary reflected the emotional strain of fighting an enemy who sought death rather than victory. Shooting down a Zero that's trying to ram your carrier isn't aerial combat, it's execution. There's no satisfaction in these victories, only relief that we stopped them short of the target. The Japanese have transformed their pilots into guided missiles, and we're the last line of defense against weapons that don't care about survival. Japanese commanders recognized that kamikaze tactics, while devastating when successful, represented the final collapse of their naval aviation capability. Conventional air superiority operations had become impossible against Hellcat dominance, forcing the adoption of suicidal measures that traded experienced pilots for minimal damage to American forces. The exchange was unsustainable even in the short term, as pilot losses exceeded replacement rates by factors of 3 to 1. Commander Genda's analysis of kamikaze effectiveness reached pessimistic conclusions that Japanese leadership refused to accept. His calculations showed that even under optimal conditions, kamikaze attacks would need to destroy American carriers at rates exceeding historical precedent to offset Japanese losses. More troubling, American defensive capabilities were improving steadily, as Hellcat pilots developed intercept tactics and radar operators refined their tracking procedures. The final statistics from 1944 painted a picture of complete American air superiority achieved primarily through Hellcat operations. Japanese naval aviation had entered the year with approximately 3,000 aircraft and 1,500 experienced pilots. By December, those numbers had fallen to fewer than 800 aircraft and 300 veterans, with replacement pilots so poorly trained that many died during their first combat missions. American naval aviation, by contrast, had expanded from 12 carrier air groups in January to over 40 by year's end, with each group operating 24 to 36 Hellcats. The industrial capacity that produced this force represented advantages that Japanese planners had consistently underestimated. Grumman's Hellcat production lines were delivering over 600 aircraft monthly, while pilot training programs graduated over 800 fighter pilots per month with comprehensive combat preparation. The spring of 1945 brought intensified kamikaze attacks as Japan prepared for the inevitable American invasion of the home islands. Hellcat squadrons found themselves flying constant combat air patrols, intercepting suicide attackers before they could reach American ships supporting the Okinawa invasion. The operational tempo exceeded anything experienced during earlier campaigns, with individual pilots flying 3 or 4 missions daily. Lieutenant Commander Vrasiu's squadron operated from the carrier Lexington during the Okinawa campaign, maintaining defensive patrols that often lasted over 6 hours as successive waves of kamikaze attacks approached the invasion fleet. His pilots intercepted over 200 suicide aircraft during April and May 1945, destroying 173 before they could reach their targets. The remaining aircraft that penetrated the Hellcat screen faced intense anti-aircraft fire from the fleet. The exhaustion that set in among American pilots during these operations was both physical and psychological. Vrasiu's diary entries from May 1945 reflected the emotional toll of continuous combat against enemies who sought death. "We're flying 4 missions daily, each one destroying Japanese aircraft that are trying to kill our sailors. The monotony of killing becomes overwhelming. These aren't combat victories, they're preventative executions. We're exterminating kamikaze attacks before they can succeed." Japanese commanders had gambled that massive kamikaze operations would inflict unsustainable casualties on American forces, forcing negotiated peace terms. The reality proved far different. Hellcat defensive tactics, combined with improved radar warning and intensive anti-aircraft fire, reduced kamikaze effectiveness to levels that American planners considered acceptable, given the alternative of allowing suicide attacks to proceed unopposed. Vice Admiral Matome Ugaki, commanding Japanese naval aviation during the Okinawa campaign, watched his forces being systematically destroyed by Hellcat combat air patrols that prevented most kamikaze aircraft from reaching their targets. His diary recorded mounting frustration with tactics that sacrificed pilots without achieving corresponding damage to American capabilities. "The Americans have created a defensive system that makes our special attacks nearly futile. Their fighters intercept us far from the target. Their radar gives advance warning of every attack, and their anti-aircraft fire destroys aircraft that penetrate the fighter screen." The final major kamikaze operation occurred on August 9, 1945. Just hours before Japan announced its surrender. Over 300 suicide aircraft launched from bases across Kyushu, targeting American carriers operating off the Japanese coast. Hellcat combat air patrols from 8 different carrier air groups intercepted the attack at ranges exceeding 60 miles from the fleet, destroying 247 aircraft before any could reach their targets. Captain McCampbell led his air group through this final battle with the tactical precision that had characterized American fighter operations since the Philippine Sea. His Hellcats intercepted kamikaze formations at multiple altitudes, using coordinated attacks that prevented Japanese aircraft from concentrating for maximum effect. The engagement lasted over 3 hours as successive waves of suicide attackers were destroyed by American fighters, who had perfected their defensive procedures through 9 months of continuous operations. The surviving kamikaze aircraft that penetrated McCampbell's fighter screen faced anti-aircraft fire so intense that only 2 aircraft reached their targets. One struck the destroyer Callahan, sinking the ship with the loss of 47 sailors. The other damaged the carrier Randolph without causing critical casualties. These final kamikaze successes represented the sum total achievement of an attack that had committed over 300 aircraft and pilots to certain death. Japanese naval aviation effectively ceased to exist as an organized force on August 9th. The remaining aircraft lacked fuel for sustained operations, replacement pilots had received minimal training, and American air supremacy made any conventional mission suicidal. Admiral Ugaki's final diary entry before Japan's surrender acknowledged the complete failure of Japanese aviation strategy against American technological and industrial superiority. We began this war confident that our superior spirit and proven aircraft would defeat American materialism. We end it having learned that engineering excellence and industrial capacity ultimately determine victory in modern warfare. The silence at Yokosuka Naval Air Station on August 15th was absolute, as Lieutenant Iizuka stood beside his grounded Zero, staring at the aircraft that had once represented Japanese aerial invincibility. The fighter showed evidence of over 400 hours of combat operations, with patched bullet holes covering wings and fuselage-like scars that recorded every encounter with American fighters. His logbook documented 114 combat missions, 8 confirmed victories against American aircraft, and survival through battles that had killed every other pilot in his original squadron. Iizuka's personal statistics reflected the broader tragedy of Japanese naval aviation's defeat. He had entered combat in 1942 as part of the most powerful carrier air force in history, flying the world's finest naval fighter. He ended the war as one of fewer than 50 surviving veterans from that original force, having witnessed the systematic destruction of Japanese air power by American fighters that combined superior engineering with overwhelming production capacity. The final tallies revealed the scope of Hellcat dominance with mathematical precision. F-6, F squadrons had destroyed 5,156 enemy aircraft in air-to-air combat, while losing 270 Hellcats to Japanese fighters, creating an exchange ratio of 19-1 that represented the most lopsided aerial combat results in naval aviation history. More significantly, Hellcat operations had destroyed over 6,000 Japanese aircraft through combined air-to-air and ground attack missions, effectively eliminating Japanese naval aviation as a meaningful force. These numbers represented more than tactical success. They documented the complete obsolescence of Japanese aviation doctrine and technology when confronted by American industrial engineering applied systematically to air warfare. Japanese commanders who had planned operations based on Zero superiority and pilot skill found their forces destroyed by aircraft they had initially dismissed as inferior, flown by pilots whose training emphasized teamwork over individual prowess. Commander Genda's surrender interview, conducted by American intelligence officers in September 1945, provided the most comprehensive Japanese assessment of the Hellcat's impact on Pacific air warfare. His analysis emphasized that American victory had been achieved not through superior individual aircraft performance, but through systematic integration of technological advantages, tactical innovation, and overwhelming production capacity. The Hellcat represented the triumph of American engineering philosophy that prioritized pilot survival, maintainability, and multi-role capability over maximum performance in any single parameter. Where Japanese designers had created the Zero by eliminating every excess ounce of weight, American engineers had built the Hellcat by adding every feature necessary to ensure mission success and pilot survival. The contrasting philosophies produced aircraft that reflected their nation's industrial capabilities and strategic priorities. Vrasiu walked through his squadron's ready room aboard Lexington, where photographs documented 3 years of Pacific combat operations. Images of burning Japanese carriers at Midway hung beside gun camera footage from the Philippine Sea, creating a visual narrative of American naval aviation's evolution from desperate defense to overwhelming superiority. Each photograph represented tactical innovations developed through combat experience rather than theoretical planning. The transformation had required fundamental changes in American naval aviation doctrine, pilot training, and maintenance procedures. Early Hellcat operations in late 1943 had revealed handling characteristics that differed significantly from previous American fighters, requiring pilots to unlearn dogfighting instincts and master energy tactics that exploited the aircraft's strengths. Training programs evolved to emphasize formation discipline, coordinated attacks, and ammunition conservation rather than individual combat skills. Most importantly, the Hellcat had demonstrated that American industry could produce military equipment superior to anything created by Axis engineering, despite widespread pre-war assumptions about Japanese technical capabilities. The massive radial engine, self-sealing fuel tanks, armor plating, and concentrated firepower represented approaches to fighter design that Japanese manufacturers had rejected as impractical given their resource constraints and tactical doctrines. Grumman's production statistics told the story of American manufacturing capability that Japanese planners had fatally underestimated. 12,275 Hellcats had been manufactured in less than 4 years, each aircraft representing over 35,000 individual components assembled with precision that maintained performance standards throughout the production run. Japanese fighter production, by contrast, had peaked at fewer than 800 aircraft monthly before declining steadily after mid-1944 as American bombing disrupted manufacturing facilities. The human cost of Hellcat superiority extended far beyond Japanese casualties. American pilots who flew the rugged fighter developed emotional attachments to aircraft that brought them home, despite damage levels that would have been fatal in lighter, less robust designs. Vrasyu's maintenance crew chief, aviation machinists mate first class John Hutchins, had counted over 600 individual repairs to Vrasyu's aircraft during 2 years of combat operations, each patch representing a moment when superior engineering had preserved human life. These emotional bonds created veteran pilot communities that persisted long after the war's end. Hellcat pilots developed shared understanding of their aircraft's capabilities and limitations that transcended normal military relationships between man and machine. They spoke of their fighters with affection reserved for trusted companions, crediting Grumman's designers with saving their lives through practical engineering that prioritized function over elegance. The strategic implications of Hellcat effectiveness reached beyond tactical battlefield success to demonstrate American capacity for rapid technological innovation under wartime pressure. The aircraft's evolution from initial prototype to final combat configuration had incorporated thousands of improvements suggested by fleet pilots, implemented by engineers, and produced by manufacturing systems that could respond to changing requirements with unprecedented speed. Japanese post-war analysis, conducted by surviving naval aviation officers under Allied supervision, revealed the scope of tactical miscalculations that had cost Japan control of Pacific skies. Japanese intelligence had consistently underestimated American aircraft development capability, pilot training standards, and industrial production capacity, creating strategic blind spots that proved fatal to Japanese war aims. Vrasyu's final mission report, submitted on August 14th, documented a routine combat air patrol over Tokyo Bay that encountered no enemy aircraft, marking the end of organized Japanese air resistance after 45 months of warfare. His personal victory total reached 57 confirmed kills, making him one of the Navy's top-scoring aces behind only Captain McCampbell. But Vrasyu consistently emphasized that individual achievements had been less significant than systematic application of American advantages through coordinated tactics and overwhelming force. The Hellcat's legacy extended beyond statistical achievements to encompass fundamental changes in naval aviation doctrine that influenced carrier operations for decades. The concept of heavily armored fighters capable of multiple mission profiles became standard doctrine for naval air forces worldwide, validating design philosophy that Japanese engineers had dismissed as wasteful and impractical. Standing beside his battle-scarred Hellcat as sunset painted the Pacific in shades of crimson and gold, Vrasyu understood that he had witnessed the transformation of naval warfare itself. The age of individual aerial combat between evenly matched opponents had ended, replaced by industrial conflict where superior technology, manufacturing capacity, and systematic tactics determined victory. The Hellcat, once mocked by Japanese pilots as a clumsy American pig, had become the instrument that delivered American naval air power with precision and overwhelming force that no amount of courage or skill could overcome. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.